Okay, we're going to start our last panel of the day now. Get your water, get situated. I'm going to introduce our moderator, is a longtime friend of the Food Policy Conference. Randy Green is the owner of WIC and Green LLC. And really an ideal person to moderate this panel, a real veteran of the Farm Bill wars, served on the Ag Committee, Senate Ag Committee for over a decade, and Chief of Staff, and has also seen it from the private sector side, and has all kinds of insights to share with us, and will be leading us through this conversation looking at agricultural and nutrition policy and perceived conflicts. So thanks, Randy.
Yeah, Thomas, thank you. And, oh, by the way, Thomas, this screen up here, I'm loving these headshots. I haven't had that much hair in years. It's been a long. That picture of Joe Glauber was not taken yesterday either. So welcome to our session. We got less than an hour. This is the last segment of the day, and there are only 3 separate escalators between you and the hotel bar at 5 o'clock. So we decided to dispense with the PowerPoints and the slide decks and so on, and we're going to do this in, I started to say talk show format. I'll say talk show-ish, because there are no potted plants, sidekicks, or rim shots from the studio band. Other than that, it's going to be a lot like a talk show. We'll do some Q&A. This session asks whether agriculture and nutrition policy are working at cross purposes. And as we get into the discussion, I think we may find some of our panelists are a little bit skeptical of that proposition as it is traditionally propounded, but they all think that there are ways that our policies could encourage healthier diets better than they do now, and we'll hear about that. This is a distinguished panel. Joe Glauber is a former chief economist at USDA, currently senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. His expertise includes, among many other things, price volatility, global grain reserves, crop insurance, and trade. And before serving as chief economist at USDA, he spent 3 years at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative as the chief agricultural negotiator. Christian Lovell is the Senior Director of Programs at Farm Action Fund. He's a former legislative director for Representative Rosa DeLauro, well known to most people in this room. He lives, though, in west central Illinois, where he manages his family's registered cattle herd, Hereford cattle herd, and he is active in the Grazing Lands Coalition. And Emma Sheffert is a policy analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center here in town. She has a Master's of Public Health from the George Washington University. She's previously worked on Capitol Hill and at the Trust for America's Health. So if you were to read our session description, which I did not write, it sets up the discussion this way. Half of the federal MyPlate nutrition guidance is devoted to fruits and vegetables, yet these foods receive only a tiny fraction of agricultural subsidies. So the first part of our discussion is going to center around what's kind of a hardy perennial of foreign policy debates. Does the pattern of spending on crop supports distort production patterns, perhaps raising prices of some things and lowering prices of others? Normally you get more of what you subsidize and less of what you tax, so do our policies tend to keep fruit and vegetable prices too high and make corn and soybeans cheap? Or is there, as some other voices argue, simply no meaningful connection, no demonstrated tie between these two? So I want to give each of our panelists a couple of minutes for their general thoughts on this going-in question. Do current farm policies tend to distort production and prices in such a way that healthy fruits and vegetables are penalized? Does the U.S., in fact, have a cheap food policy? And if your answer is yes, how do you think that affects health? And even more pointedly, do you think farm subsidies contribute to the obesity crisis? So, Joe, you first.
Okay, thanks. First of all, as an economist, I'm not here to defend ag subsidies. I think they're costly. They're put in place, I guess, to address a whole set of problems for which, many of which I think the market is probably better suited to address, and I think for the most part they're wasteful and other things. But that aside, do they have an impact on food prices? I think there it's if any, very, very small. And I say primarily for the fact that, one, the retail value of food, or the farm value of the retail, what things cost in the grocery store is very, very low. I think the overall farm value is about 15% for food at home. It's about 25%, a little bit higher. But the fact is you have to do a lot to underlying commodity prices to have some impact on what you're paying in the grocery store. And the classic example is bread, where the cost of wheat is only about 5% of the retail value of bread. I think many of the current farm and price and income support programs are not tied to what you produce, but what you historically produce. So even there, the link is pretty weak. It's not really forcing you to produce corn, for example. I think there's plenty of other things. And I think there's a lot of policies that actually raise prices. We point to the sugar program with its high tariffs, ethanol program, which yanks out 35 some odd percent of corn, or diverts 35% of corn production to biofuel production. Same we see that now with vegetable oil. They can have some minor impacts on prices in the short run, but over the long run, I think the impacts are pretty small. So overall, I think farm programs, if you're trying to address food and nutrition issues, farm programs are really blunt instruments. And again, the link, I think, is pretty weak.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Lots to unpack there, and we will. But Christian, how does Farm Action look at this question?
Yeah, well, I guess I would start by saying it doesn't really matter what we're talking about. I do think incentives matter. I do think incentives make an impact on things and change the nature of things. And we'll get in to talk about that in a little bit. But I guess I want to take a step back. And when you start talking about nutrition and what people eat in people's diets, I guess us at Farm Action really have been fighting for food system reform. And I'll just give you an example. So I, a couple years ago, moved back to West Central Illinois. That's where I'm from. That's where my family's farm is. It's been in our family for several generations. We are pretty close to the Mississippi River, not too far from Iowa. Iowa, the heart of the Midwest, that is the breadbasket of America in terms of agriculture. I mean, you don't get much better than the soils of North Central Illinois or Iowa. I think when most people think of agriculture, that's the area they think of. But I'll give you this anecdote. I got into Washington, D.C. last night. I got something to eat this morning. I am able to get a fresher, healthier, more locally sourced meal right here in downtown Washington, D.C. than I am able to get back home. And that's, where I'm from is supposed to be agriculture. So just that alone should tell you something's off. And so I hope we get a chance to talk about that a little bit later. But just from the start, I just want to leave you with that, is the fact that that's an occurrence tells me something's way off.
Okay. Thanks. Emma, you've thought and written a lot about nutrition policies, and I know we want to hear from you more broadly on that a little bit later, but what do you think about this question of farm subsidies that we're starting from?
Yeah, thanks, Randy. I mean, as you said, this is not my main area of focus, and I think if you would have asked me 2 months ago, what I thought about the connection of farm subsidies and the food that we eat, I would have told you absolutely there's a direct connection. I think the more that I dug into this, the more I landed kind of right in between where Christian and Joe have said. I think we definitely can look at some incentive programs. I think we can look at how we're incentivizing consumers to eat healthier, mostly is my background. But when we look at the farm subsidies as they currently exist, it's pennies on the dollar for what it ends up being for what the consumer sees at the end. And so I'm not sure that's where the best money is spent. Not to say that we should get rid of subsidies by any means, but I think if we're looking at making the most impact on people's food, I think we can really look much closer to home when it comes to incentivizing healthier foods in grocery stores. When we look at, providing more dollars for SNAP and WIC and the feeding programs that we are already supporting, I think we're getting a lot more bang for our buck in those types of programs.
Joe, I'm gonna pose a question to you that you probably got numerous times as chief economist, which is, what's the best argument against your position? Now, I have a few if you don't, but what if you were arguing the opposite case?
I do all the time.
Yeah,
Split personality.
what do you think you would say?
Yeah, no, and look, I would agree pretty much with what was said by my two other panelists here. I think to me the important way, if you really want to address nutrition, then I think you really need to address the consumer side, not the producer side. Again, my feeling is that that's pretty blunt. Clearly, there are farm programs out there that distort production, to some degree. Take the case of corn, which is sort of the classic one that a lot of people like to point to as sort of the evil, because we have these all these subsidies. That means that it contributes to this big production of high fructose corn syrup. But even there, it's a complicated story, right? I mean, we have these high sugar tariffs, so that brought in high fructose corn syrup. You also have, again, as I mentioned earlier, you have ethanol, which is increasing the price of corn on the other side. And again, these things, how are they affecting consumers? Well, high fructose corn syrup is a pretty small percent of the overall cost of food. I mean, it is very, very small. So it's not through the price of cheap high fructose corn syrup. And it's not so much and otherwise you're talking about going through a cattle, hogs and poultry and other things, where if you're going to have lower feed costs, and that can give some incentives to increase meat, it's just a very tenuous link. I think, again, if you want to have some impact on consumers, then I think you really need to address those programs at consumers, not at the production side.
I suppose a relevant factor, which maybe argues in support of your original position, is the sheer disparity in acreage. The amount of acreage devoted to corn, beans, the other supported commodities, versus that for fruits and vegetables is just, I'm not sure if it's a full order of magnitude, but actually probably is.
Oh, yeah.
And so to shift even a portion of that into fruits and vegetables, it's not clear you could do it, and if you did, it's not clear that fruit and vegetable farmers would like the resulting prices for their products, right? So, Emma, for a minute, let's talk about what the federal government might be doing right, and then we'll turn to areas where it might improve. What do you think about the overall effectiveness of nutrition programs like SNAP, WIC, TFAP, school meals, and then how would you rate them at actually encouraging healthy diets, which could be two different things?
Yeah, I want to say first a thank you to all the panelists who spoke on the last panel who really queued this up for me. I mean, really talking about the history of SNAP, the benefit of the WIC program, especially the shout out to the fully funding of the WIC program in this budget. That was definitely something I was going to shout out as well. So it really sets me up for success if you guys already have that baseline. I think when we're talking about effectiveness of these programs, we have to think about what was the intended purpose of the programs originally. So as Dr. Warren said in the last panel, when we're looking at what SNAP was meant to do, it was meant to be a feeding program and was meant to be an economic stimulus program. So not to say that there's not ways that we can incentivize nutrition and healthy eating in that program, but if we're looking at just the basics of this program, it is effective at reaching people. It has been effective at, reducing food insecurity, especially, really high rates of food insecurity. And so if we're just looking at that aspect of it, I would argue it has been effective. Again, I think we're going to get to some of the ways that we can improve it a little bit later on. When we're looking at things like WIC, which is a much more targeted nutrition program, targeted at women, infant, and children, again, there's a lot of data to show that it's been highly effective, not only at increasing fruits and vegetable intake, but getting really crucial nutrients to mothers and infants, in those really important first year or two of life that can help with things like prolonged health of children and can really help reduce things like maternal mortality, which, as we all know, is on the rise. So there's a lot of benefits even just within these programs that are doing much smaller economic-wise compared to SNAP. And then looking at things like school lunches, I think there's a lot of debate around the effectiveness of this, but it is one of the few programs we have that really follows the DGA. And so when we're looking at it that way, we have done a lot to make sure that we're looking at, constructing these meals for children in a way that provides them different types of nutrients that they maybe don't have access to at home. And again, is really effective at increasing test scores, making kids healthier, introducing them to new types of fruits and vegetables that they maybe aren't aware of. And I'm really encouraged by things like the summer EBT expansion that has been going on to kind of fill that gap that happens during those summer months for children. And then also things like the fresh fruit and vegetable program. While it's not perfect, I think those types of programs that really target low-income schools have been really effective at, again, increasing fruit and vegetable intake, which is exactly what we want to see for children at that age.
The nerd in me can't resist pointing out two fun factoids here. On school meals, there is peer-reviewed research that says, whatever we older people remember from school cafeterias of our youth, those are the healthiest meals kids get. And that's true across the income spectrum, probably especially for lower income kids. And then the second factoid is, in terms of the effectiveness of these programs, it was striking in the pandemic era that the expansion of the child tax credit and emergency allotments under SNAP caused probably the sharpest percentage decline in child poverty that had been seen in a long time. Joe could tell us whether it's ever or not. And sure enough, it went back up when those pandemic benefits expired. So, Christian, let's bring farmers a little more into this. A number of producers, including young producers, I think have built businesses by producing fruits and vegetables, livestock, often organically or with other sustainable practices. Many have found niche markets, from restaurants to farmers markets. So do you see that as an area where there are some success stories, but more pointedly, what kinds of policies do you think these producers need in order to thrive, and are there policies that are pushing in the other direction and holding them back?
Yeah, well, I do think I think just within the last decade, you've seen a rise in these niche markets, people finding, whether it's CSAs or stuff like that, you have seen people create success there. I hope for a world in which, if you want to sell fresh, local, healthy foods, I don't want that to be a niche market. I want that to be the market. I think that's, if we're talking about changing the diets and changing the system, that's where we've got to get. And I think another thought on that is, I want eating local, fresh, and healthy to be the standard. I don't want that to be something you've got to go and find a really expensive boutique restaurant here in DC to do that at. What I'll also kind of take a step back and think about, we've talked about some of the instruments up here. In my mind, there's two different waves there from the farmer perspective, right? There's the actual program, and then there's how that exists in practice. And so I can tell you from experience, if you're a young farmer who is in rural America and wants to do something with your property, in my neck of the woods, you are set up, the system is set up for you to go into grain farming. And I'm not against that at all. But if you want to pursue fruits or vegetables, you're going to struggle finding somebody in the county, the county office that can help you with some of those programs. You're going to struggle finding an insurance agent that can, insure your crop. I mean, they're just not used to it. And all the other wraparound services, right? I mean, say, and I already got way too much going on myself, but say I wanted to wake up tomorrow and grow heads of lettuce and stuff like that to create a CSA. I don't know in my community who I would call for technical assistance. But I can tell you, if I had 500 acres of corn or beans, I know who I'd call for fertilizer. I've got plenty of options as far as agronomists that come. I mean, those sort of things don't exist for the fruit and vegetable growers on that scale. So I mean, we can look at one program and say, did that program, change this or that? But I'm really talking about the system that a farmer finds himself or herself in terms of their decision making. The support is not there.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point. So, for example, I think it's fair to say for a lot of farmers, crop insurance is at least as important, and for some probably more important than the traditional price and income supports. And if you go on the Risk Management Agency's website, you can find specialty crop insurance programs for like 70 different crops. But I think it's also fair to say there's a lot of dissatisfaction on producers' part that whether those really work as well. This was, in fact, prominently, I believe it was front page above the fold in the New York Times yesterday, so go back and look at that. But this is a live issue, and I'm not a crop insurance person, so I don't know what the answer is. But I think that fits with what you're saying.
Yeah, and there's that. There's also, from the insurance agent perspective, there's some challenges there, right? I mean, if they don't have experience writing the kind of policies for fruit and vegetable growers, there's a hang up there. I can also just tell you it's easier to write a policy for someone with 500 acres of corn or beans than it is to write a policy for someone who's got, this many acres of lettuce, this many acres of tomato. I mean, it is different, and if your insurance agent is not experienced in that, there is a hang up there. And there's also an incentive, there's a lack of incentive, and Dr. Glauber might know this much better than I am, but the agent doesn't have as much incentive on those smaller policies.
Yeah. So Joe, unlike me, you are a crop insurance expert. What do you think about this?
Yeah, no, I think fruit and vegetable, crop insurance for fruit and vegetables has always been a challenge. They started late. The program was originally developed around the row crops, and it really wasn't until, I'd say the 2000s where we really started seeing a lot of crop insurance being offered to a lot different mix of fruits and vegetables. But as said, I mean, a lot of that is actually in the California or Florida. It's less so in the Midwest. If you want to insure those crops in the Midwest, you probably need something what's called a written agreement, which is something where RMA, the Risk Management Agency, does allow you to write those sorts of policies, but you'll need an agent that will be willing to do that and a company that's willing to do that. So no doubt about it, there's a challenge with that.
Thanks. So we're jumping around a little bit here, but Emma, I want to get back to nutrition programs. And you touched on this earlier. Some of the programs encourage or require the purchase of specific foods. For example, the fruit and vegetable voucher in WIC. Others, like SNAP, don't limit food purchases, although they do limit purchases to food and not non-food items or alcohol. And then there would be some kind of in the middle, like TFAP, which purchases a list of specific foods from a catalog, but doesn't dictate what mix of those foods the food banks actually distribute. So the question for you, Emma, is would you change the rules for any of those programs, and if so, how? In other words, would you lean one way or the other toward specific nutrient-dense foods or more general foods like SNAP?
Yeah, I think this is a hard topic, and I know from firsthand experience because when we worked on our Farm Bill report about a year and a half ago, we had a bipartisan task force with a lot of really great thought leaders who were thinking about this and a lot of other things related to the Farm Bill issues. And when it came to things like restricting or incentivizing certain types of foods within the SNAP or the WIC programs, there was a lot of debate, and I'm seeing some folks who I'm sure remember that. And I think we get down a really slippery slope if we start to talk about restricting certain foods within SNAP. I think if we were in a perfect world, we would say, oh, these federal programs that we're funding should only go towards these healthy foods, these ideal ways we want people to eat, but that is not inclusive of people's diets. That doesn't provide dignity to people who are on SNAP to make those choices for themselves. It doesn't allow for things like buying your kid a birthday cake, the one time during the year, if we're cutting off things like sugar purchases in SNAP. So I just wanted to level set with that, just to say that there is this conversation that happens about how do we restrict what people on SNAP can consume, and I think it gets really murky, when in reality we should be talking more about the incentives. So like you said, with the WIC program, we've seen the data that supports the fact that when you provide people with these incentives to buy fruits and vegetables, they do, and they consume more. And that is a great way to get people to have, their SNAP dollars that they can spend on the foods that they need for their families, while also incentivizing these additional purchases of the foods that ideally, people would be eating a lot more of. And then additionally, when it comes to WIC, I think there's a way that we could really increase the access to this program. It's one of the programs that I think about 37% of people who are eligible for WIC are on the program. I think there are ways to reduce the burden and make sure that we're getting more mothers and children on this type of program so that they get those benefits from the fruit and vegetables, from the formula, from all of the nutrients we want to see in the first couple years. I think when we're turning back more towards the SNAP program, I think we could do a lot more when it comes to these pilot programs, these incentives, as I said. We're seeing a lot of great data come out of the GusNIP program, and I know that a lot of folks in here are working on also things like food as medicine, which the Bipartisan Policy Center is looking at as well. And we see a lot of GusNIP being used for produce prescription programs, which can help not only mitigate the diet-related diseases, but can help with some of the prevention, getting ahead of the diet-related diseases that we're seeing so prominently. So I think there's a way that we can expand these, make them more accessible for people, make them more permanent, allow for better communication between GusNIP programs, community-based organizations, all of the, administrative hurdles that we're hearing from those groups. And I think lastly, I would just say when it comes to the school lunch program, like I said earlier, I'm really encouraged by the summer EBT program, but there's always more room to grow when it comes to providing healthy fruits and vegetables. I was in one of the panels earlier and someone mentioned the smart snack options that were provided at schools for those quick pickup options, between lunches or right after lunch for kids to pick up, and how when USDA put out these rules, manufacturers and producers just changed their formulas to fit within these parameters as opposed to offering what we already know are healthy foods like fruits and vegetables and whole grains to children and making those more accessible. So I think there's ways that we can make those restrictions a little bit tighter and just really encourage healthy food through these incentives, through offering them especially for children.
Would you also agree that with respect to SNAP, it is a nutrition program, but it's a little more than that too. It's a basic part of a not terribly generous social safety net in the United States. Since the repeal of AFDC in 1996, SNAP has been one of the few entitlement programs available to everybody. And occasionally when some, not all, policymakers talk about pushing SNAP toward more nutritious choices, there's sort of an implication that SNAP recipients need to earn their benefits. They need to buy the foods I want them to eat so they can. No, this is part, at least if you buy the idea of a social safety net, this is part of what ought to be an entitlement for all Americans. And even if you don't agree with that with respect to everybody, surely most people would agree with respect to children.
Yeah.
And so are you going to tell children, I want you to eat this, that, and the other thing, or your parents are not going to get SNAP benefits?
Right, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think it is, at its core, an entitlement program. And like I said, there's ways to incentivize the eating of healthy foods. There's ways to educate people. But when we start looking at either folks earning their food or restrictions when it comes to SNAP benefits, you're chipping away at the core of the program. You're pulling out the dignity that these SNAP recipients have when it comes to being able to pick their own foods. You're, I think, alienating folks who we are really just trying to feed and provide the basics of nutrition for. I mean, there's nothing worse than having no food.
I'm going to pose a couple of questions to all three participants, but as I do that, I would invite people who have questions of their own, and we will have a few minutes for that, to approach the microphone. I'm going to keep asking questions until somebody's at the mic. So if you don't want to listen to me anymore, make your way there, and we'll take those questions as soon as somebody comes up. But for the three of you, no question, the federal government would like us to eat more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, low-fat and non-fat dairy. The dietary guidelines for Americans, the pending healthy rule that Mr. Jones talked about today, a lot of initiatives point in that direction. But you have to say that their success over time has been mixed, and I think that's being sort of charitable. Charts in the last DGA publication showed about 90% of Americans fail to consume the recommended amounts of vegetables, about 90% fail to consume recommended dairy servings, only slightly more get enough fruit. There's kind of a basic question here, which is, are we able to change people's dietary behavior? Because maybe we've changed it. I could point to the fat-carb pendulum, but but the government has been telling people fruits and vegetables are something you need to consume more of, and all of us agree, for a long time. Hasn't happened to the extent we'd like. So is all of this a fool's errand to begin with? Joe.
Yeah, no, you raised a great point, and I think clearly we've, again, had a lot of education that has had less impact. If you're talking about changing consumer behavior, typically you look at what shapes demand, and that's income and price. And so income, we look at something like SNAP, which has been, again, a basic safety net program, which has allowed poorer families to actually purchase more food. That's all good. But if you're talking about individual food items, then you're really talking about subsidies or taxes. And taxes are tough. They're very hard to structure correctly to try to hit the particular thing you want to hit. I mean, we have a lot of experience now with fat taxes and with beverage taxes. And so, I think there's a lot of lessons that can be gained there. Taxes also are pretty regressive, right? So if you're a poor family with it spending not so much 15% of your household income, but more like 25, 30%, that can be a real cost. And then the other thing is subsidies. And I think Emma talked about some of the things we've done on fruits and vegetables to encourage more consumption in some of our programs. And I think there we have seen some success. It is costly, unfortunately. And I think that is something where if you're going to put, to me, that's a good way to spend some more money, however, if you want to encourage that sort of behavior.
Thanks. Christian, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I'd say not a fool's errand, but it might feel like it. Dr. Glauber's right. I think income and price are important drivers there. I do think there are other drivers, maybe not as important, but things like convenience, taste, quality. I tell you, that's why we at Farm Action are very interested in the ag trade deficit. I don't know if we'll get there, Randy, or not, but I'll just tell you, and I think there's data that actually supports this out of the Farm to School program, but just in that example, kids prefer the taste of a tomato that was grown maybe in their high school as part of their FFA ag curriculum, that was picked vine ripe. It tastes better than a tomato that was mass produced in another country, that was picked when it was green, was ripened with ethylene gas, and then put on any mode of transportation to get up here. There is a taste difference there. I think there's also research that shows there is a nutrient density difference there. And that's why I'm really passionate about, if we're going to do this, my lens of how we get there is fresh, locally produced, and I think that it has to be part of the solution. It's not going to change everything, but I do think that will help change the preference. I'd like to see more of that produce grown locally, picked locally, and eaten locally.
Thanks. Emma?
Yeah, again, I agree with Christian. I don't think it's a fool's errand at all. I do think we're working against a very tough system, and I think we've heard a lot of that today, when we're talking about the panels on marketing of food to children. We're thinking about the billions or trillions of dollars that these companies are spending marketing to children, and to us too. I'm getting marketed at all the time too for different things. And we're told that, this supplement will fix us, this protein powder will fix us. There's so much misinformation around nutrition as well that I think it's really hard to take a step back for a lot of people and to really start the education basics over of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, healthy fats, balanced diets. It really shouldn't be that complex, but our system and the society that we live in makes it incredibly complex and confusing for a reason. It makes it complex so that there's more things to market to people. It makes it more complex so that you can target these advertisements at children, all those kind of things. I think we could all, and I think as a system, we could take a step back, start the education a lot sooner. I've heard from other panelists today that we should be starting this education in schools, and I completely agree. To Christian's point, teaching kids to grow their own food, understanding where their food comes from makes them, want to eat those foods, makes them change the way that they eat. Maybe they bring those foods back to their parents and say, hey, can we buy these the next time you go to the grocery store? I think starting that education really young and continuing that through the lifetime so that people know, the real basics of what it takes to create a healthy diet.
I think Thomas had a question, and then I do want to come back to this ag trade deficit issue before we close.
Nobody
Go
wants
ahead,
to
Thomas.
ask a question. I know I should defer to others, but
No others
so,
have gotten
yeah,
up, so go ahead.
But as you were talking, and particularly as I'm hearing Christian, and I agree, like with this vision of local ag. It's very appealing to me. But I feel like our food system is it's predictable that we have the food system that we have in terms of economic efficiencies. It's very efficient. It's efficient by virtue of efficiencies of scale. And that we found out during the pandemic that things that are efficient aren't necessarily resilient. If the food system was a person, it would have one kidney. So you have all the salad made in California, and have all the porks in Iowa, and so I guess my question is for Dr. Glauber, like how do you get out of that paradigm if you're just letting the economic efficiencies push shape production? It seems like this is exactly what we're going to get, and I really don't see. I'm vexed by kind of like how we get the local ag off the ground.
Yeah, so great question, and I think ideally we all would like to have far better food, and I think we can, it begins.
I just want, like, one other point, like, it's efficient also to just give everyone the lowest common denominator, to give low quality products for the lowest common denominator. I mean, I think that's also like an efficiency.
Yeah, but I get frustrated because I think people think. I think back at grade school for me. So you go to the cafeteria, and we had, as Randy says, a pretty nutritious diet. What was it? It was canned goods. With all due respect, you can do stuff by growing local tomatoes, but you're talking about a seasonal factor here that I think is great. And I've worked on community gardens on Capitol Hill, when my kids were growing up, and those sorts of things, and it's great, but it's hard to feed at the scale you need to feed. So that that's what you're up against, is a cost thing that isn't just let's make really bad, poor nutrition, blah, 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 let's get it out the door at the lowest common denominator. No, I mean, I think you can, it is trying to get a lot of food out to a lot of people and do it in a way that people can afford it. And I think that is, it's tough for a poor family to shop at a farmer's market. I mean, it just is. And should they be able to spend SNAP dollars there? Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with that. I mean, absolutely. Yeah, if they should be able to buy whatever they want to buy. But it's hard to think about this as a model if you're talking about, a limited budget for food assistance. I mean, I think that's the reality of some of this. And so, yes, by all means, if we can improve, the quality of our food. I mean, this is what Randy's been trying to get to this food or the import side of things. I mean, what bringing in Mexico or tomatoes from Mexico or blueberries from Peru means that every day of the year you can find those things in your grocery. And I can tell you, it wasn't too long ago. Certainly, I can go back to my 20s. And it was hard to find blueberries in the grocery store for 9 months out of the year, and those are big improvements, I think. You look at per capita consumption or per capita disappearance is how we measure it. If you look at a lot of fruits and vegetables, those are all way up. Now, you can argue about the quality, I'm with you, but that's a demand issue. Consumers can get better quality if they're willing to pay for it.
Great points. But Christian is eager to weigh in, and you're allowed to talk about the ag trade deficit too, because I know we wanted to get there. And then we'll get your questions. So.
Thank you, Randy. I got a couple points, and in the interest of time, I might move through them pretty quickly. I really love conversations about efficiency or economic efficiency. I guess my thought process always goes to efficient for who? Because I can tell you the current system is very efficient for the largest grain traders. It's very efficient for food manufacturers. Might not always be super efficient for the consumer and their families. And there can be some conversation there. But whenever I hear people talk about economic efficiency, I always want to think efficient for who. The second thing, and then before I get to the imports issue, Dr. Glauber talked about how some of this is very complicated, and I get that. Feeding people is not easy. I'll also say though, I think there was probably a time in this country, maybe if you asked my great grandparents whether or not they could ever imagine a system where there's a gas station in every town, sometimes multiple gas stations in every town, and how you get the gasoline there. You know what I mean? Like, we can solve big problems in this country. Now, when we're talking about oil and gas, there were a lot of government subsidies that allowed that to happen with different pipelines and stuff like that. Probably going to need more investment on the ag side, but we can tackle big challenges. There's no doubt about that. We've proven that. Lastly, on the import side, and I'll agree with Dr. Glauber. I think imports do provide that year-round availability and consumption. I think the problem that I have is that we're actually seeing imports not just covering that seasonality, we're seeing imports at a level where they're displacing specialty crop growers in this country and displacing acreage. And so that's what I have. If they were just coming in out of season, I might be more likely to let that slide. But I think when you actually look at the data, you're seeing the imports displace American producers, and that really has negative implications on our food system resiliency and many other aspects.
You get the very last question.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'll say I very much so appreciate these discussions. As my husband and I, when we started dating 10 years ago, I was in dietetics school. He was in his PhD economics program, and this is what we would talk about and argue about every single night. And so now I'm a dietitian that eventually ended up in ag. But my name's Becky Garrison. I work for the National Association for State Departments of Ag and work on nutrition policy and food systems policy. And so my question is that we are actively looking and working on areas that actually bring both sides politically together in the Farm Bill, where we can spend $1 that is about nutrition security, food access, but then also something that's the same dollar being spent to lift up growers, especially small, medium-sized producers. And then we have, that safe, abundant food supply that we know U.S. producers, have the resources to do. But with that, we've seen programs like the Local Food Purchase Assistance Program come out, the Local Food School Purchase Program come out recently, also looking at, of course, GSNP. So how do we actually see those dollars being spent where we see an improvement on consumption? Also the Resiliency Food Infrastructure Program. So there's been some really great developments. And so I think there's some folks in this room that I know that we get excited about these programs. We're trying to educate on the Hill with them. We're trying to tell agencies, yes, this is working, this isn't. But I'm curious, do you see other avenues that actually sort of bring this all back to food, who grows our food, and how do we get back to the consumption of that food in the political space, or other, just other programs that you see actually pulling those two divisions together?
So I'd invite Emma to start, and maybe then let's just work our way across. Any ideas in response to that very good question?
Yeah, really great question. I think you mentioned a lot of them. When I've been thinking about it is, we're looking at the programs such as the Double Up Bucks that allow people to spend more money at those local food markets, that, increase access to these fresh fruits and vegetables while also bringing local producers to these markets. I think those kind of things are a win-win, but those are relatively small scale. So I think we can also look at those assistance programs for schools to bring in local farmers. I've heard a little bit that can be a difficult process for farmers to actually come in and do that. So, there's definitely hurdles to address there. But I think also, with those programs that come into schools, we can start, like I mentioned earlier, with some of that education so that these kids know, oh, your food was brought from this farm that's only 5 miles down the road, and, they do that kind of thing. We can start to incorporate some more education with these kind of programs so that we have an understanding of how these food systems and healthy foods kind of meld together. I'd say those were the biggest ones that I saw. I'm sure Christian has some other thoughts though as well.
Well, I have a bit of an overarching thought, and I believe this for some time. I do think food is a powerful uniter, just with us as people. In a time where there's not a whole lot of, you don't always have things in common with each other. Food is something everybody has in common. Everyone's eating, hopefully on a daily basis, etc. But I'll also say, food can, for a lot of people across the country, food can be something that causes a lot of stress. I don't know about some of you, but sometimes I feel like I can't get out of the grocery store for less than $100 no matter what I buy. That just seems like that's where we've gotten. I guess I'd just say that is there are so many different pieces of this, the production side of things, the consumer side of things, the incentive side of things. But I really do believe that the diet quality of the average American has got to go up. When you look at chronic diseases, when you look at what that's doing to society in general. I also believe that people do want to eat, and I don't even think it's eat healthy. I think people want to nourish their body, and there might be a lot of different things that prevent that from happening. Like we talk about, whether it's a price thing, whether it's a lack of knowledge, whether it's lack of convenience. We talked about some of these other nutrition programs. Some people on those nutrition programs, you don't want to restrict the food that they have to purchase because they might not even be able to prepare what you're asking them to buy. Mm-hmm. So this is very multifaceted, and I guess from my lens, I see the role that the farmer can play in bringing to bear, the type of food locally that can be more available, that can be fresher. And I do think that's important. Like I said, even if it's just on the basis of taste alone. So I guess that's just my lens where I see it from. I see the farmer side of things. We have to support the local producer who's feeding his community, or her or whoever. because that's a very important part of this.
Joe, you get the last word, and then we'll wrap up. I invite Thomas to come on up, because no doubt there are some closing announcements.
Thank you, great panel.
Okay, yeah, and I'm not going to add much. Frankly, I think there's more similarity on this panel than you might think. I do think this all begins with the consumer, and I think that if you want to influence consumer behavior, then there are ways to do that in terms of subsidizing things. Some of the programs we've talked about, it costs money. And I think those are things that, local communities have to make those decisions on, the federal government has to make those decisions on. I don't think the way to do this is to start with the farmer. I think if demand is there, there will be plenty of people to meet that demand. But I think that to try to incentivize that at the consumer level, you're talking about trying to influence things in terms of subsidies on certain types of foods. And nutrition is complicated. It's been said by every one of us up here that you have to be, it's not an easy thing to say, well, here's the magic bullet that we're going to put little carrots in a bag and subsidize those, and that's going to improve things. But it is comprehensive. It needs education and all those things.
And I will run the risk of cliche in closing in saying that if these solutions neglect either the consumer or the farmer, they're not going to work. They're not going to give us the kind of thing that we wanted. Emma, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, just one final thought to the final points that Joe was making. These are expensive, the incentives for sure. They are expensive, but when we look at the types of diseases that are coming out of poor nutrition, those are even more expensive. And so I think we really, as a society, have to weigh, do we want to do this prevention, or do we want to do some of the treatment later on? And I think that we've shown that these programs can be the prevention.
Okay. All right. Well, give our last panel a big round of applause. Give yourselves a big round of applause. We're starting a little bit later tomorrow, 8:25. So come eat breakfast. Yeah. And thank you for attending and sticking it out for the day. Thanks, Randy. That was great. Yes, I'm responsible for kind of the red herring setup there because I see a